Started. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Lauren Kuby with the Global Institute of Sustainability and Innovation. It's my honor to introduce our moderator, ASU's Kathleen Merrigan. Kathleen is the director of ASU's Swette Center for Sustainable Food Systems. And from 2009 to 2013, she was Deputy Secretary to Secretary Tom Vilsack and the Chief Operating Officer of the Department of Agriculture, where she led efforts to support local food systems. She's known for authoring the law establishing national standards for organic food and the federal definition of sustainable agriculture. Kathleen, thank you for moderating today. Take it away.
Hey, thanks, Lauren. It's great to be here. And I'm delighted to welcome our speaker. So Beth Hoffman. She's an author of several books. She began her writing career focused on culture, producing a food series on KUER, which is an NPR affiliate in Salt Lake City. She received a grant to document the stories of immigrant women as they cooked in their homes. We're here, though, today to discuss her most recent book, which is Bet the Farm, The Dollars and Cents of Growing Food in America. I have read it cover to cover, and I believe it is really an excellent book and worth everybody going out and buying it, shopping for it, and just digesting it. It's just wonderful. Now, Beth farms on a 540 acre farm in Iowa with her husband, John. While she's only lived on the farm since 2019, she's spent every summer on the farm over the past 5 years. So I'm about to ask Beth to give remarks, but before I do so, as a reminder, you're going to have an opportunity to ask questions of the author. I've prepared some of my own. I'll take the prerogative as moderator to ask Beth some questions. But if you have questions, please enter them into the Q&A feature at any time. And Lauren will organize them and feed them to me, and we'll try to get through as many as possible. So Beth, thanks so much for joining us today, and we'd love to hear some opening remarks.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. I'm calling in from the Knoxville Public Library, so you can see these cows. These are our cows, but they are not moving because it's a photo. So let me share my screen. Sorry, this is always fun. All right, so as Kathleen said, I am a, where do I put us over here? Okay, I'm a journalist. I've covered food and agriculture for about 25 years and doing a lot of public radio, print journalism as well. And then I was an assistant professor for 6 years in the media studies department at the University of San Francisco. And now I'm an Iowa farmer. We raise grass-finished beef, meat, goats. We sell hay, and we also have foraged foods like mushrooms that I'll show you a photo in a second. And this is Snooks, our border collie Australian shepherd, who helps us with cattle as well. So this is the book, Bet the Farm. And what I did was use my personal story of moving to the farm to talk about how agriculture works. So I also talk a lot about how we got here today, because my belief is that if we don't understand the realities of farming, we can't actually make lasting changes in the system. So to make it, if we really want to have a more sustainable system, we can't make any real changes if we're not addressing how it actually works. So I just want to give you a sense of where we live and what this area of the world looks like. So this is a picture from our farm. We have 530 acres, and we just actually purchased 40 surrounding our house. We live about 2 miles up the road. And it's in south central Iowa, so it's really rolling hills and forests. And you'll notice, as opposed to a lot of the country this year, that it's very green, and we have a lot of water even when it doesn't rain much. this picture, I believe it's one of the ponds. We have about 7 ponds on the property. And so we have great pasture. And we raise cattle on pasture, on grass, for the entirety of their lives. And we don't use any irrigation ever. None of our neighbors do, even in growing corn and soybeans. And you can see again, very lush green rolling hills. We move our cattle every day. We rotationally graze and regeneratively do agriculture. You can see the electric fence running through here that keep the cattle in. So on a daily basis, we move them. We have about 30 cow-calf pairs and 30 yearlings as well, because the cattle spend an extra year. So as opposed to most of the cattle system in this country, we have older cattle that are around. And like I mentioned, the forage foods, these are oyster mushrooms, the first of the season I was excited about. We pick morels and chanterelles, also things like bee balm, elderberry. And we also have a chestnut orchard that we put in, about 100 trees right now, not as big as some. We just visited a farm that had a few thousand, which was just amazingly beautiful. But we're starting small. And we also have goats, which we also move. They don't move quite every day, but you can see the electric fencing behind my husband, John, there. And so we move them around. They have been amazing to just devour invasive weeds like multiflora rose and honeysuckle. And we're just excited to have them. They're a lot of fun. All right, so how did I get from San Francisco to Iowa? My husband here, John, he always wanted to move back to the farm. And probably in our first 5 minutes of meeting, he was a neighbor that I was living in a kind of a row house when I moved to Berkeley to go to grad school. He came out on the back porch that we shared and introduced himself, told me about how he just was in Iowa. And I said something profound like, Iowa? And he said, yes, Iowa, very proudly. And, said that he'd like to move back there as soon as his kids were grown. And at the time, I probably couldn't have pointed out Iowa on a map. And, I didn't really know much about the Midwest. Whoop, there's us. I had reported on food and agriculture enough at this time that it made sense. It wasn't completely out of the blue to think about like doing these practices that I had studied over all these years. It kind of made some sense, but I didn't think much about it. And as the kids got older, we started talking about leasing the farm from John's father, who at the time was in his late 70s, early 80s. And it took us about 1.5 years to figure out that transition, which we could talk about more later. Transitioning the farm is a huge process, and there's a lot of people going through that. So it's an important part of the book. But basically, after we got that lease, I can remember distinctly sitting down with my mother, who's a CPA. And we finally came to this point about like, well, what are we actually going to do on the farm? We need a business plan of some kind. With everything else going on and trying to get the lease, we hadn't really thought too much about it all. So she started going through the expenses with us, and we had decided to buy the 30 cows from John's dad, Leroy. And so that was a cost we had in that first year. And we also had the lease we were going to spend, which was a very discounted rate, but still a significant amount. There was also costs like, fixing old broken tractors, because that's what we had. Fuel costs, fencing, the list went on and on and on. And so we looked at like potential sales, and I'll point out things here, but we basically, added all this up, and bam, my mom reveals to us in our first year, we'll probably lose $25,000 or so, which was about $6,000 more than we had even decided to put into this whole thing. So I was kind of shocked because after we even, we were paying off the cattle in those first years. So even after like the third year, we still were only going to make like $20,000, $30,000 a year. And that was for one person working full time and at least half of my time as well. And that would be that $20,000, $30,000 was like if everything went well, and in farming, things often don't go well. So I started, like a good reporter does, looking into it and learned that we're not alone. In fact, if we made $20,000 to $30,000, we would be much better off than most farms. And I'll show you this chart and kind of point things out, but as actually we're looking at this first column here. So you could see at this USDA chart, this tiny line that's here in the first section shows you on-farm income. So the median income for all farms is right there, which in 2019 was what, this is the one that's in the book. It was less than $300. So let me just say that again. This means that out of our 2 million farms in the country, 1 million of those farms were going to make less than $300. And that was in a year that was not very good for crop prices, but it was quite good for government payments. And I pulled out this sentence here for easier viewing here. At the median household income for farming was positive in 2019 at $296, so that less than $300. This was the first time since 1996 when the median household income from farming was not negative, which means that those great years that is often talked about out here in Iowa for corn, 2010 to 2013, that didn't mean that the million farms, 1 million farms were making a positive number. But as a reporter, I was thinking, okay, how do farms stay in business? These are the kinds of things that we hear in agriculture, these kinds of stories, that the year is bad, right? It's just that we heard about, we're having a bad year because of trade. This is, farmers aren't making money this year because of the weather. But I hadn't really felt like I heard a lot about how most of our nation's farms were struggling most of the time. So even in this, like this one here that says, there was this great year where the heartland, quote unquote, the heartland saw record farm sales. So just keep this in mind for a second. It's talking about 2020. This is an updated version of the chart I just showed you. So the USDA updates this constantly. But what it shows in that record sales year is that farmers were losing money. So in 20, right here, it was actually a negative $1,248 was the median income again. So I just really thought about it. How can this be? And what is this other column next to it? That's this off-farm income that I really was wondering about too, because that seems to be, when you're talking about total farm income, that's the key to the whole thing, is this off-farm category. Okay, so Beth Hoffman uses our personal story then of moving to the farm to talk about these broader issues in farming. And it details how the system kind of works. So some of the questions I dive deeply into in this book is the question of why most farms don't make money. So, and most farms, I'm including the ones that made a little bit more than $300 because I don't really call that making money for your job. What is that role of off-farm income, and what does it play in keeping agriculture alive in this country? I also learned a lot about the history of agriculture because I wanted to understand how we got here to this point. And I thought I knew it as a journalist, but a lot of what I learned was completely new information to me, which leads to this like the other kinds of common misunderstandings there are in agriculture. I really wanted to understand, what do we think we know and is actually not really what's the reality. I looked into, and I really framed the book around the kinds of myths and these stories that we tell about farming that I feel really impede the ability for us to change anything in the system, and new ways that we can talk about farming to help us find some solutions to these pervasive issues. So I'm going to stop there and stop sharing my screen and come back and talk with Kathleen about all of these things.
Okay, thank you so much, Beth, for that introduction. So we're going to get, you gave us some numbers, you gave us a little spreadsheet action. I'm going to get you to push on that a little bit more. So you lament the amount of debt farmers carry today, sharing as an example that the average farm in Nebraska owes $1.3 million. You write, quote, "Instead of a romantic life of growing tomatoes and raising happy cows, farm life is actually a job full of spreadsheets, receipts, and file folders," end of quote. So elaborate a little bit more on this point for our viewers.
Yeah, I guess, the relationship between debt and spreadsheets is an interesting one as well, because, that the amount of debt is, it's just the fact that a lot of what farmers do is work under this idea of this bigger is better myth. I frame it as, where you have to kind of keep getting something new, buying the newest machine. You've got to rent more land. That's a huge one. Get the better seeds, which are much more expensive. And this kind of, it requires that you spend a lot of time then detailing to know what your bottom line is, to understand what the cost of doing business actually is, which is a skill set that many farmers don't necessarily have. And it's because it's so variable what your actual market price is going to be in the end. And the market price often has nothing to do with the cost of production, because you have so few buyers in the market oftentimes that it becomes a very complex kind of spreadsheet to try and run. Like, you have to spend a lot of time with it and be really thinking about, okay, well, if my bottom line says, I have to get at least $3.80 for a bushel of corn, what then do I do if it's not at that point? And how does the market work? Where, when should I sell? What happens right at harvest time as opposed to other times of the year? So it becomes a very, very complicated math problem in effect.
I always say that people think that farmers are very conservative as a group, and perhaps politically so, but they're some of the wildest risk takers I've ever met, because there's only so much you can do. And you tell a story about, putting in oats as a cover crop, and there's just only so much you can control. All right, so my next question is, I pulled this quote out from one of your chapters. You said, "Behind every successful farmer is a woman who works in town." Can you share your thinking behind this observation?
Well, yeah, to clarify about it, that was, and I'm going to pronounce her name wrong. I should look it up. She's a professor who studies off-farm income. And I really want to say her name properly, so I'm going to look for it really quickly. Her name is Margaret Jalowski, and she works at Ohio State, I believe, still. So she actually, when she was a PhD student, she told me this great story of she was, kind of looking for a research project, and she saw this sign on Etsy that said exactly that quote, behind every farmer is a woman who works in town. And, she thought to herself, like, is that true? That would make a great research question if it is. And so she went into really, digging into that, and has found that, yes, to large extent, it's women, but it's not just women that are working in town. It is, but every family has to have someone working in town. So that chapter, I really talk about this idea that some bankers shared with me, saying that when they look at the income of a family, if they, let's say you're a farmer and you go in to borrow to buy a new combine, you would be looked at for the family, the total family income, not the farm income, which is really a fascinating thing when you think about it, because what it boils down to is that most farms are being supported by that off-farm income, not just to pay for the family, but to pay for the actual farm and the running of the farm. So the researchers' work found that was completely true, that it's not just, the off-farm income is essential. And so I really, I question, I don't know as an economist what an economist might say, but I don't know of another industry that is supported almost entirely by other industries. Like it actually doesn't support itself, which is a fascinating thing to me.
Yeah. Well, I also know, having worked with the National Young Farmers Coalition, that healthcare is one of the greatest barriers these next-gen farmers are dealing with. And it's certainly gotten better with Obamacare, but also those off-farm jobs have the benefits that also make farm life doable in some cases. All right. Yes. So yesterday I was, on my Twitter account, and I tweeted out about, I wasn't the only person, about this parcel, this 500-acre parcel in Iowa that sold at $26,000 an acre. In other words, a small scale farm by Iowa standards that cost someone $13 million. One of your book chapters is really about the issue of being land rich but cash poor. Can you share a little more about that?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I really wish, I could understand the math behind that, because you could not recoup those kind of costs really ever with the agriculture. I mean, you'd have to hold on to that land. Your return on investment is never, you just, so I guess the bet that those people are taking, and I don't know in this sale, I know in the one before that, it was reported that the neighbors were all there and kind of bidding on the land, which is what usually happens, is the neighbors buy it. And then all of a sudden these outside bids started coming in, and the price went up and up and up, and every local person was out, and somebody from across the country ended up buying the land. So I assume that's the same sort of thing that happened here. It's a huge problem for, and I just want to point out too, I guess, like the average farm in Iowa is much smaller than people think. It's something like 360 acres. So there's many more farms of the kind of size that you're talking about than people think. People have that as one of these misunderstandings that I point out in the book. That's whole idea is like corporate America is running farms. They're not yet. It's family farms are like 98% of all farms. So when when you're buying up farmland like that, basically all of your worth, all of your family wealth is in that land. And it means that in order to get out, you'd have to sell it for a high price. But it also means that the next generation has really an impossible time coming up with that kind of capital to get into farming at all. And with the average age of farmers nearing 60 years, I don't understand what we think is going to happen next.
Well, do you have some creative ideas on that? You tell a story of you and John going to a beginning farmer workshop, and the workshop leader confessed to you that if people really understood how hard farming is, they wouldn't do it. So what is it that we need to attract that next gen farmer and rancher that we so desperately need?
Well, that would make, if I knew the answer to that. I think that there's a few things. I guess that what we're trying to do is something that's somewhat unique. I find there's a lot of people, at least in Iowa, there's a few handfuls of people at least that own property who are looking pretty desperately for the next generation to come on. They're willing to do so at really discounted rates or give land away. We're looking to really have people come onto the land to work alongside us, something we're calling co-farming. This kind of comes from the co-housing idea, where you own a few things together and then everybody has their own ownership of it. So the idea would be that people would run their own enterprises. We have a young man who we think is going to actually work with us next year, having pastured chickens. And instead of charging him rent, the idea would be that these chickens are doing a great ecological service by eating the fly larva that plagues our cattle in the summer. So it's a win-win for both of us. He's contributing to the farm. We would be helping him get on his feet. And who knows what will happen in the future, perhaps using a device like having a land trust and conservation easements. A lot of people are trying that. Perhaps that will allow us to pass it on to the group of people who are farming it. That's the ideal. But, it's also was well pointed out to me in the book that particularly with farmers of color, just saying like, ta-da, here's free land, come on out, it doesn't solve any of the systemic problems that we actually have. So a huge one is housing. If you have no housing on your farm, it really doesn't matter who, you could post signs that it's a free place to come farm and nobody can do it because there's no housing in rural America. Same thing with loans. We have to be able to make loans and credit. All sorts of things need to change in the system. So we have to actually be cultivating that at the same time as the land.
Right. But I note that in your discussion about how cooperation could be one of the ways forward, you mentioned Eleanor Ostrom. Of course, she passed away in 2012, but she was a professor at ASU. So I have to ring that bell. All right, I'm going to go to the questions. We have several in the queue. So one of the questions is, are you leasing land? And if so, from whom do you lease the land? I know in the book you say about half of farmland is farmed by renters. So is not owning your farm an issue?
Well, we're renting it from family. So it's John's father and we are leasing it. We got a very discounted rate for that, which I talk about a lot in the book that, we're coming into this with privilege then. We came into it with some family wealth. We came into it with access to land that has been passed down for the generations. John's the 5th generation on this land. And a lot of that has to do with this discriminatory system that we have. John's family was afforded loans and government programs and those kinds of things to help keep him on there. So yes, well, like you mentioned as well, over half, I believe, of Iowa farmland is now rented out. And that's because families are holding on to the land when someone passes away, but they don't want to farm. So we're ending up in this position in this country where people can't get into farming because of these capital costs, and yet we are renting it out to people, typically only year-to-year leases, which is a huge problem as well. Because why would you care as a corn farmer? Like, why would you care about putting in a cover crop if you don't own the land and you might be gone the next year? So it's a huge problem.
Can you tell us a little bit about your sales process, and can you talk about the risks involved with various methods of selling? You know, look, for example, a lot of farmers do sell under contracts of various sorts. Do you have a secure market? Do you have a plan? How should we think about that?
Yeah, it's very difficult. So we would love to direct market most of our beef. The problem with that is there's very little, infrastructure available for smaller farms. So there's not many places to take that beef to be processed. And certainly from what I understand, there's no federally inspected slaughterhouse that we could go to as a smaller, producer. It's like those are owned by JBS or those kinds of companies. So it's a very difficult thing to find a place where you can sell even within the state and direct market to your customers. And then, of course, it's again, all of that spreadsheets and business knowledge and sitting down and doing the marketing and all of that kind of stuff. The reason why we would do it is because we will then garner a lot larger percentage of each food dollar that our customer spends. So currently, I think it's 14.3 cents on the dollar that a farmer gets when you shop at the grocery store. So for every $10 you spend, a farmer gets a whopping $1.43. And that's just not, the other 85% of it is going to the marketing, the brands, and the CEOs of those companies, quite frankly, are the people who are taking the money. So for us, that it's worth that extra work and trying to figure that out. So right now we have two beef that are ready. We have an actual date at the locker, which is, we had to set up 6-8 months in advance. And we then have to find, for each quarter and half beef, we have to find those people. We have to have them work with the locker. It's a very convoluted process. But we also have a few wholesalers that we work with, so we can sell to them what we can't sell. So that's a comfortable process for us because we don't have huge amounts of animals.
We'll see if the $500 million that USDA has said they're going to spend to build a more resilient meat processing infrastructure makes a difference for the small scale producers like yourself. Time will tell, I'm hopeful. So
and here in Iowa, there's like a new butchery, like artisanal butchery bill. So there's supposedly money to train people as well, because of course that's the problem. Where do you find these workers to work in a slaughterhouse? Yeah.
So a question in the chat is, the conventional narrative is that you need to innovate, buy the latest machine, seed, etc., and attain economies of scale. Otherwise, you're not competitive. Is this narrative true in your view? Can you be a successful farmer with quote unquote older technology and smaller scale technology?
Well, that's a great question. It deals with a lot that I talk about in the book. So I call that belief system the bigger is better myth throughout the book. And there's many problems with it. I mean, as you pointed out, it's the idea behind it is that in order to keep up, you've got to keep buying things. You've got to have the latest technology, the best machinery, so on and so forth. And the reality of that system is that if all of the farmers are in competition trying to get the highest yield, what happens every single time in history is that you end up with overproduction of your crops. And so you end up, by basic, economic principles, you end up with your supply way outstripping the demand. And in the past, it's been, the Earl Butz years, for example, that people like to talk about, when he famously said everyone should grow fence row to fence row. That actually panned out for a while because he doubled exports within that time. So there was a market for it, and subsidy payments dropped really dramatically actually in that period of time. But then, as does every time, there was too much product. So what happens also in farming that's unique to agriculture is if I was producing something, manufacturing widgets, and the price of widgets goes down, I limit my amount of widgets often, right? So that I can then rebalance the market. What farmers do in that case is plant more and they yield more. And so the price, that's when we just go in these free falls of way too much in the market. And it's caused huge recessions and depressions throughout time. So that history is something that I learned a lot about and talk about in the book. The other huge one that I'll just mention here, the other huge problem with that economies of scale is that we can't all have an economy of scale, right? It necessitates the idea that many of us need to go out of business so that very few of us can attain the economy of scale that's desired. So just buying a combine or renting a little bit more land it doesn't actually get you anywhere. So it gets farmers in a cycle of debt, but it doesn't get them out the other end where you achieve that economy of scale. And one last one I'd like to add to that list is that what's surprising to me is that those very, very large farms that are supposedly have this economy of scale, they're supposedly very successful. Why do they then need millions of dollars in subsidies? That doesn't equate to me. If that actually works, that you achieve this economy of scale and your farm can become profitable, you should not be then on the government dole of getting more subsidies. That doesn't make sense to me.
But you do write about subsidies. You say, despite the myth that independent farmers believe the government should stay out of their business, even farms with the largest yields are not self-sufficient enough to function on their own without government subsidies. So you're hitting right at this point. So do you think farm subsidies are here to stay? And do you think they're allocated fairly?
I guess I don't feel expert enough to really, and I think they're convoluted enough that very few people really understand the system. What I observed is that you had like a program that people have kept adding to and morphing and changing. And so it's like, it's something that doesn't really work for anybody. So I don't know if they're here to stay, quote unquote, because even at the FSA office in our county, like it's completely confusing. There's no farmers in there that understand that system. Like when you walk in and you got to get your base acreage and you got to sign up for the PLC or the ARC and like, what should I do? And they just basically tell you like, oh, we're recommending the PLC this year for soybeans. You're, okay, here, and we sign, and that's it. That's as far as like most farmers understand the system. What I will say that I also experienced is just, it's not really just the subsidies, it's the entire support system that's built around these commodities that's there for you. So if you want to grow corn, you can walk into any number of offices in your county, in your state, the seed dealer, like everybody is there to support you in doing this. They have maps ready for you. There's, you know, this seed or that seed, and you can call on hotlines and get information. There's always a market report every day to support you. If you want to grow tomatoes, that just doesn't exist, right? We walked into the USDA office and we said, we're interested in growing organics. And they told us, I literally, this is a quote, like, there's a guy in the next county who grows organics, maybe you could ask him. That's the kind of support that was there.
The no information, no knowledge, no advice kind of support. Yeah, I remember vividly you writing about that, because having been a champion of organic and having been pretty high up there at USDA, that depresses me to no end. Anyhow, this is not about my trauma.
Well, but I guess that was the point also I try and make in the book is that I don't really, it's like, you can't blame these people who are working in the office, who there's a new set of rules every 4 or 5 years, everything is constantly changing there. And so to even just keep up with the programs that most farmers in your county need and use is a full-time job. So you have to have people who are really invested in learning what else is available, what other things you could recommend, and having time to spend like visiting farms and giving advice. I ask for it all the time. They come out and say, well, we don't have a program for that. And I said, no, I'm just looking, could somebody help us figure out, you know, what to do with this situation? I'm not looking for money.
Yeah. I will say, during the 4 years when I served as deputy, we had 40,000 USDA employees take Organic 101, just to make sure they knew some of the basics, because I found there were a lot of myths out there about organic. But anyhow, I want to move on. So Kelly writes about what she feels is necessary to be a farmer. And she says it's people with grit and hardworking values. And she talks about her husband being a dairy farmer who was up at 4 to milk the cows, off to school to return in the evening to milk the cows again. You don't get a day off. It's hard work. And she's thinking maybe offering internships will allow people to see the hard work that it takes. It reminded me of something you wrote, and that was, where is it here? I just love this. You write that often the biggest hurdle for farmers, it turns out, is their own mindset, and that this leads in a way to self-exploitation. Can you unravel that for us?
Yeah. So I guess this is the other great myth. I talked about the bigger is better. The other one that is really dominant in our mindset in this country is what I call the agrarian myth, or lots of people call it the agrarian myth. And this myth came, you know, from Jeffersonian times, where he wrote about farmers as being this, you know, grit, this like salt of the earth, getting your hands in the dirt, independent. That's also a very big thing with this mythology of farmers as being, you know, you just need to be like rugged and out in the field and just working hard without complaining is basically where that comes down to. And the problem with this is, let me also say another part of that myth is that we're stewards of the land and we're nourishing our communities and we're feeding the world. And all of those are huge weights to be carrying on your shoulders. Like, I don't know of another industry, I don't know of another job where you have these lofty, humongous goals and you're just supposed to sort of tough it out. So what researchers have found, not just me, is that especially farms that are really dedicated to the environmental side of things, they tend to then not be charging the kinds of prices that they would need to survive, working way too hard, and they burn out. And we see it repeatedly with young farmers. I've been to many beginning farmer events where people are just like, I don't know how long I can do this. What if I wanted a family someday? And I think that one of the narratives that really needs to change is this myth. Like, what if we thought about our bodies, our families, our sanity in the same level of importance as feeding the earth, feeding the world? How would that then shift things? Like, if this woman's husband didn't work like that, is it really going to change your bottom line? Like, to what significant end? And maybe you become actually more sustainable in the long run, not only as a farm, but as an individual.
So you had talked about the Economic Research Service at USDA. They put out that annual food dollar that shows how much the farmer gets of the dollar we spend, which probably helped prompt a question in the chat, and that is, are we paying the right price for our food? If we paid more, would that situation for the farmer change? Does it take more than that? Some reflections on that.
Yeah, I had a farmer, actually, Nick Wallace, who's the rancher here. He talked to me about it, and he said, over time, when we went from the point where farmers were also growing commodities, but they then sold into kind of a more local market. It wasn't controlled by sort of national and international multinationals. As we gave up the extra work of the marketing and the logistics and all of that kind of stuff, we also gave up as farmers a lot of the power, and it went to those companies who are doing value added kinds of products. So you see, when a bushel of corn is selling, and I'm just going around like just general numbers, if a bushel of corn, which is 56 pounds of corn, is selling for $5, let's say, and so does a box of corn flakes sells for $5, which is like a pound or less of corn, that's extremely off, right? So it's like, what's happening, I believe, is not that we're paying necessarily too little for our food dollar, but that the people at the very upper echelons of those multinationals are taking way too much of the piece of the pie, right? So the fact that the CEOs of JBS, for example, is making what's the equivalent of like, 300 workers, or that to me is where the extra money comes in. So I'm not sure that we need to raise the dollar, raise what we're paying, have more of it go to the CEOs, and farmers get a couple of pennies more. I think we need to extract that power back, is what my advocacy would be. And I think that, questioning who's representing farmers and what they are actually advocating for is a good place to start.
One of our listeners is asking about control of the industry in beef cattle, saying that there's so much control in the grain trade. Is it similar in beef cattle? I know that there's a lot of talk in Washington now about attending to monopolistic behavior in American agriculture. I don't know if you have thoughts on this that you could share.
Yeah, I think that this example is, so what's happened in beef is that there's very, very few buyers. at the end of the food chain. So you've got farmers. Farmers typically sell into feedlots. So that shrinks down how many buyers there are. But then there's really a shrinkage after that, where there's really 4 companies control the cattle market. It's the same for most markets, really, the chicken and pork and also corn. Like if you have corn in our area, there's very few places that you can sell. Cargill is, you know, where you take your stuff. And so, yeah, I think that those, you know, I don't know how to, I mean, I guess my thoughts about that and what's happening with the cattle people at this point is that they reacted to it en masse. I've listened to many of them talk about these problems. And so what happened is they pushed on the organizations that were representing them. The Cattlemen's Association, for example, started to push on this. And so this is a perfect example to me of where the farmers were trying to take back some power. I don't personally think that this whole idea, like these companies being transparent about their pricing, to me, that doesn't really go even a fraction as far as it needs to in getting rid of this monopolistic behavior. But it's a great example of what's possible with farmers when they get together and they organize and start advocating for their own rights.
Okay, I'm going to take the prerogative of the last question. And it's probably, maybe it's the hardest question you're going to be asked. How's that for a warm up? So we learn from reading this book so much about Leroy and Dot, your husband's parents, John's parents, and about the family's history, the history of the family farm, the land, life in Iowa. And yet you open your book with a dedication that reads, "Hey, Dad, I did. I wish you were here to read it." It's very emotional. I think that's lovely. "Hey, Dad, I did it. I wish you were here to read it." So if you had the opportunity to mark one passage or story in the book to share with your dad, what would it be?
Yeah, hardest question for sure. You know, I think I read last night at Beaverdale Books. I had a reading and I read this passage about us trying to sell oats, and should I read this little tiny bit? I have it here.
Please.
All right. So it's talking about our oats we're ready to harvest, and we were all excited about it, but they weren't quite dry enough. And so, and it talks a lot about the world of oats, but anyway, this is for you, Dad. Then the wind came. A storm was fast approaching, clouds stretching to the ground like a black veil traveling toward us from the not so far distance. We all stood on Andrea's porch, a very Iowa thing to do in a storm, and as a wall of cold air enveloped us, the bushes in front of the house bending horizontally as if hit by a wave. Suddenly, the top of a 40-foot tall, dead-standing tree snapped and crashed to the ground not far away. My sister-in-law, a normally cool and calm Iowan, unfazed by extreme weather, hung her head out from the side of the porch to get a better view of the open fields to the north. "Okay, let's get into the basement," she stated matter-of-factly, the first time in all my summers on the farm that anyone had ever gotten nervous about the possibility of a tornado. The 5 of us headed down. Even the dogs who never came into the house were carried down the stairs. The rain hit the windows as if someone had turned a hose on full force, the sound against the siding as if someone had turned the volume up to 11. Then, as quickly as a faucet had turned on, it switched off, and we all immediately went outside to see the damage. A few trees down, branches everywhere, but no tornado. No houses flattened. That night, the men do what men do, and talked about how they never thought the storm was that big of a deal, how they had all seen so much worse in their lives, how they couldn't believe we had actually gone into the basement like a parade of weenies. he was a guy who, he was funny and loved reading. And so I like that, more poetic style for him.
That's lovely. That's a beautiful way to conclude, Beth. And hopefully your mom's listening. I know she was hoping to be a part of this event, and we wish you really great speed on your book launch and tour. I want to tell people out there who are listening that the book is going to be on sale from our locally owned and beloved Changing Hands bookstore. So Lauren is going to put the link, if she hasn't already, in the chat function for people to get to Beth's wonderful book. I want to thank everyone for the great questions. I want to thank you, Beth, for taking the time to be with us today. I think we all learned a great deal.
Thanks so much. It was great.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Beth. Thank you, Kathleen, for a great conversation.
Thank you.